There is a specific kind of devastation attached to the first real fight in a new relationship, one that people who have been together for years often forget the intensity of. Before it happens, everything has felt easy, warm, almost effortless, and then a disagreement arrives, sharper and more painful than the actual content of the argument seems to justify, leaving both people wondering, often in genuine panic, whether this means the whole thing was a mistake, whether the connection everyone believed in was somehow fake all along. Carl Jung's understanding of projection and the persona offers a precise explanation for why the first fight lands so much harder than every fight that comes after it. Jung believed that in the earliest stage of any relationship, before real, sustained contact has had time to correct it, each person is relating not entirely to the actual complicated human being in front of them, but partly to a projection, an idealized image built from their own hopes, longings, and unconscious expectations laid over the real person like a second, more perfect face. This early idealization is not dishonest or foolish. It is, according to Jung's understanding, simply how the unconscious naturally behaves in the presence of someone new who provides enough surface resemblance to the inner ideal to make the projection stick. The first real fight matters so much because it is very often the first moment the actual real person breaks through this projected ideal in an undeniable way. The disagreement itself may be small, but what actually collapses in that moment is not simply a disagreement about the specific topic. It is the first real crack in the idealized image, the first undeniable evidence that the person standing here has needs, limits, and reactions that do not perfectly match the flawless figure that had been unconsciously projected onto them. This is precisely why the first fight can feel disproportionately devastating, because what is genuinely being lost, or at least genuinely being tested, is not the relationship itself, but the comfortable illusion that had been quietly covering it. This explains why fights later in a relationship, even genuinely serious ones, rarely carry the same specific quality of existential panic that the first one does. By the time later fights occur, the idealized projection has already been substantially replaced by an actual working knowledge of the real person, flaws and all, and a disagreement no longer threatens to shatter an illusion that has already, in large part, been dismantled through months or years of real contact. The first fight is uniquely painful, precisely because it is doing this dismantling work for the very first time, and the mind, unaccustomed to this particular kind of collapse, tends to interpret the intensity of the feeling as evidence that something has gone fundamentally wrong, rather than evidence that something is simply happening for the first time. This offers something genuinely important for understanding this experience, without concluding, in the middle of the panic, that the relationship itself was a mistake. The first fight is not a referendum on whether real love exists between two people. It is far more often the necessary and inevitable moment when an idealized image begins giving way to an actual, three-dimensional person, complete with the ordinary friction that any real relationship between two separate individuals eventually produces. This transition is genuinely uncomfortable, but Jung's understanding suggests it is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the relationship is becoming real in a way it simply could not be while the projection remained fully intact. This suggests a genuinely useful way of relating to this specific moment when it arrives. Rather than interpreting the intensity of the pain as proof that the connection was never genuine, it is worth recognizing that this particular quality of devastation is characteristic of exactly this stage, the necessary and often painful shift from an idealized image to an actual relationship with a real person. The question worth asking is not whether the fight proves the relationship was a mistake, but whether the actual person, now becoming visible, imperfect, and separate from the earlier projection, is still someone worth building a real relationship with now that the more accurate picture has finally begun to emerge. There is real relief available in understanding the first fight this way. It reframes an experience that feels in the moment like catastrophic evidence of doom into something closer to a difficult but expected milestone, the point at which two people begin the genuine work of knowing each other as they actually are, rather than continuing to relate through the more comfortable but in the end more fragile, idealized versions each person had unconsciously constructed of the other. Think honestly about the first real fight in your own most significant relationship and consider whether the devastation you felt was actually proportional to the argument itself, or whether it reflected something larger, an idealized image beginning, for the first time, to give way to the real and separate person underneath it. If you can recall a first bite that felt disproportionately devastating right below the single word for what you feared it meant about the relationship at the time, naming that fear honestly and comparing it to how the relationship actually unfolded afterward often reveals how much of that early panic belonged to the collapsing projection rather than to the real connection underneath it. Because the first real fight that feels like the end of everything was never, according to Carl Jung's understanding, proof that the relationship was built on nothing. It was far more often the very first and most painful evidence that two real people had finally begun to actually meet each other.